If you're trying to decide between n8n or make.com, this video is for you. There is no question that I'm getting asked more often than which of these two software applications that I choose, and this video is going to be covering that by going over the 36 biggest differences between these two platforms. Not only that, but you're going to be picking up a ton of sweet tips and tricks about how to use both these platforms in this video. Let's dive into it right now. So essentially the first thing that I want to talk about here is AI agents. Now, the world is probably going crazy right now over these, and right now, as of the time of this recording, only one of these software applications has this, and this is n8n. So if you guys are looking to incorporate AI agents into your business today, then I would definitely recommend going forward and moving into n8n. Just keep in mind that make.com is probably absolutely terrified and absolutely freaking out and probably working 24/7 right now just to release this piece of technology into their business, because they know if they don't, they're going to be losing a ton of money, and they probably already are. AI agents essentially just function as autonomous agents that can do tasks for you. They can have independent decision making and do things without you having to exactly tell them how to do things in a rule-based automation workflow, just like what you see here, where it's just going from one step to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. Now, moving on past that, I want to talk about pricing, because both of these platforms have completely different pricing. And as you can see here, I believe that n8n definitely wins this, as well as the AI agent category. Let's go into how the pricing models work for both of these. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is make.com. And so with make.com's pricing, they essentially charge based on operations down here. And so what an operation is it's essentially every single module that you see here. This is an operation, this is an operation, this is an operation, and so on and so forth, all the way to the end. So if you think about a workflow like this could maybe cost me 15 operations worth of data, right? And so this can be, adding up quite quick. And so with that being said, this is going to be more expensive, whereas with n8n, they charge on a workflow execution basis. So if we go back to the same example, this whole thing here would only charge me once for this workflow, right? This whole thing is just going to charge once, which is really, really nice. But also just keep in mind too, when we're dealing with these workflow executions, if you're using things like AI agents, you might have all of these sub agents down here, and these are all separate workflows as well. And so this can add up quite quickly. So if you are using these sub agents and calling multiple sub workflows, then you're going to be billed quite quickly as well. So just keep that in mind. But the cool thing about n8n is that they also have this community edition down here. And what that means is that you essentially can download it and store it locally on your computer, and you don't even have to frickin' pay a penny. Like, it's just 100% free to use n8n. All you have to do is set up a Docker environment or store it on your local computer. I'm going to be releasing a video on exactly how you can do this in a couple days from now, but if you want to save money, then this is definitely the way to go. And so for that reason, n8n wins both on the pricing category and the local hosting category as well. Now let's talk about speed. And so what I mean here by speed is essentially how quickly can you, if you were a beginner, pick up one of these platforms and start making real progress and rolling out automations essentially today. And so the answer is that you can technically do it with both platforms. You can do it with n8n, you could also do it with make.com as well. But I would say that personally, make.com is going to be just a bit easier for you to get started. And so let me explain why. So if I just open up like some random module here, this kind of data, how we're like mapping data in here, it's just a lot easier to process. It's a lot easier if you don't have a technical background. Things like functions here, this is just a lot easier to read because they're doing something called abstraction, which instead of presenting it like code, they're just presenting it like no code solutions, where it's just really easy. You can see it, and like even though this might be complicated if you've never seen like these functions before, it's a lot easier to understand than if you were to do the same thing in n8n, right? Where essentially you can have the same functions, but all of a sudden you're like dealing with strings, or you're dealing with like these different, like a different way of looking at the same functions. And it can be a bit intimidating if you're trying to map this in, right? And so for that reason, I would say that make.com is something that you could probably pick up just a bit easier, and it's if you don't have a technical background. Now, if you do have a technical background, then n8n is probably going to be the best option for you because there's a lot of options to customize things along the way. And so for that reason, I would say that it's probably a bit faster to pick up make.com. And I just showed you two examples, but I feel like those two examples are kind of like a microcosm for how you're going to interact with the software. It's just going to be slightly easier, but you definitely don't need a technical background to do either, and you can pick them both up pretty quickly, especially if you just watch videos online. And my channel gives you tons of walkthroughs on tons of different automation builds. The best part is they're all free. You can just download them in a matter of a couple seconds. So take a look at my channel. If you like content like this, please make sure to subscribe down below. You'd make me very happy, and thank you. So moving on, the next thing that I want to talk about is native integrations here. And so what I mean by native integrations is how many actual applications plug in. So you can see that if we just navigate over here, we have make.com. And make.com has, at the time of this recording, about 2,000 of these applications here, like LinkedIn and HubSpot and Anthropic and Webflow and NetSuite and Canva. And so there's tons of different applications here. And what's going on in the back end is that their team has gone through the process of setting these up so that you don't have to do the heavy lifting. You don't have to do all the technical behind the scenes to set this up. And so that's really nice. Whereas with n8n, they only have approximately 1,028. So it's about half. Now, the one thing I will give them credit for is that when I was looking like 2 months ago, it was at like 400. So I don't know if they just randomly updated this. I feel like this updates in real time, but I think they're just like literally hauling ass and they're just getting up to speed and they're just rolling this out really quickly, and mad props to them for doing that. And if they continue with this, they can probably have more integrations by the end of the year than make.com. And so for now, with that being said, I believe that make.com wins with native integrations. Now let's talking about actually setting these up, because this is a whole nother can of worms that you're not really going to know until you try out both these applications. And I wish this is something that I knew from the beginning, right? Because this is a huge deal. So essentially, let's take a look at make.com here. And so take something like Google Drive. You're like, the world, pretty much the whole world uses this, and this is pretty standard functionality, right? You'd expect to be able to connect it in here, right? And the answer is that, okay, it's pretty easy in make.com. All you have to do is just essentially add in your account here, and you can just click add a credential and then sign in with Google here, right? And so it makes it super, super easy. That's it. It's OAuth, just how you log into Google, you log in here, right? And it's done. But with something like n8n, it's a massive, and if I didn't say massive enough times, I'm going to say it one more time, massive pain in the butt. And so if you look at Google Drive here and we try and connect it in, we have to add our credentials. And then it says, hey, we need a client key and we need a client secret and we need you to put this OAuth. And like, the thing is like, you know, this is just going to take you time. Like, if you know exactly what you're doing, this is probably going to take you 4 to 5 minutes. But if you don't, and you have to read the docs or whatever, and you know, it's going to take a long time. And you might be sitting there being like, okay, well, there's a lot of documentation on Google Drive. But what about the thousands of applications that you may want to use that don't have a lot of like documentation on them? And so usually with these docs, they're pretty easy to move forward with, but they can also be a massive pain in the butt. And with Google Drive, this is one of those cases. And yes, you can spend time like literally bushwhacking through the Amazon rainforest worth of documentation here. I probably would take my chances with the Amazon rainforest, fighting off like tarantulas and orangutans and all that kind of stuff. But you can also do this kind of documentation too. But yeah, I just wouldn't, you know, it's just a lot harder to get started when you're dealing with this than when you're dealing with make.com. So for that reason, make.com wins both the native integrations and also the connections into places like Google Drive and all that kind of stuff. The next thing that I want to talk about here is triggers. And n8n definitely wins this category because they can allow you to connect multiple triggers together, whereas with make.com, you're only ever allowed to have one trigger. So let's talk about this. So essentially, with something like n8n, let's open up a workflow here. Essentially, I'm just gonna, back out of this. You can have multiple triggers that start this workflow. So a trigger is just essentially, hey, how does this workflow start? And then actions are everything that happens after the trigger starts. And these are what takes place. And so if you take this example, for instance, we have two triggers, and what these triggers are when somebody fills out a form. And so you can think about like a form just like this, but just to make it a bit more practical, I'm gonna go to my website here, and you can go down to get a quote. Now, the thing is maybe you have leads coming in from like Google Ads, maybe you have leads coming in from SEO or Facebook ads or whatever, right? And you just want a nice way to integrate all of these forms together so that they all start the exact same workflow. Well, you can do that by having separate forms for the same workflow. And when you look at something like make.com, unfortunately, you just can't do that. You only get stuck with one trigger. So if you want to have two triggers, well, guess what? You're going to have to start a completely separate workflow or do some workaround where you're like, feeding in HTTP requests. But I'm not going to get too down the rabbit hole because that's way too off topic to talk about. But it's just nice having the functionality to do multiple different triggers all within one workflow. This is a massive game changer. And so for that reason, n8n definitely wins on the trigger section here. Now they also win on the trigger starts and the built-in forms. So let's go over this as well because these are all triggers too. And so in n8n, you can create multiple different triggers here that are just really easy to get up and running. And this is one of the things that I immediately came over to n8n. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, thank you so freaking much for doing this, because this is something that I really don't like about other applications, where when you're dealing with triggers, it's just really easy to get started. It's like, hey, instead of you having to configure something on some other application and just spend all this time like setting something up if you want to quickly test it, you can like literally just have a button click and it just starts the workflow, right? It's just you click one button. So let's load this in here, and you literally can just test it by clicking the button, and that's it, right? There's no third-party application like Google Drive that you have to connect in or some BS like that. It's just immediately you get access to it. Some other triggers here as well are like you can also have these on chat messages here. And I'm not sure if my face is blocking that. I apologize if my face is, but here it is. So we have this on chat message. So if we're thinking about like AI agents, instead of us having to depend on something like Telegram or Twilio or WhatsApp, you can essentially have a built-in trigger here, which is their just native on chat message, which makes it super nice because instead of you spending 10, 15, 20 minutes configuring this, you can get it up and running in a matter of like literally 2 seconds, and then you're good to go. The other thing is you can build in forms here. You can create your own custom forms. You could add them to your website or whatever. And this just makes it so nice to get up and running. Long gone are the days where you're like, crap, like I got to use Google Forms to quickly test this, or I got to use some other form software. It just makes it super easy. You can come in here, you can customize this however you want. You can give a title, you can add form elements like first name, last name, email, phone number. There's tons of different stuff here in terms of like how you can configure these questions that you're asking. And for that reason, I definitely think that n8n wins on triggers, on quick triggers, on built-in forms, on all of that kind of stuff. However, one interesting thing that I don't think they excel at is with most trigger types. And the reason why is that with make.com, most of these trigger types are instant, whereas with n8n, most of them are polling. So let me explain what I mean by that. So if we circle back to make.com and we look at the trigger here, okay, essentially what this is it's a watch files in folder, which means that essentially this only fires when something is added to a folder. Similarly, in Google Sheets, it only triggers when something is added to the Google Sheet, and it's instant, right? And so if we look over at n8n, for example, and we look at the Google Sheets here, the Google Sheet or Google Drive trigger, we can type in Drive here, for example, and I can say, like, I can scroll down to the triggers, which I think my face is blocking, but I can do like on changes to a specific file. And so essentially what this is doing is it's having a pull request, and it's pulling this Google folder every minute or 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. And let me explain why this is such a big deal. So let's talk about this polling. I'm going to switch over to my Blackboard here and kind of draw this out. So what a pull request is doing is essentially we're having n8n ask our Gmail account over here, hey, has any new emails arrived, right? And a poll will be a request sent at a specific time interval. That time interval could be 1 minute, it could be 1 hour. you get to determine what this time interval is. And with this pull request, it's going to take a look and see, hey, is there emails that have been received? And if there is, great, it'll return it back. But if there isn't, then it's not going to return anything back. But it doesn't matter what it finds on this side of the equation here, because you're still getting charged for this. And so let's say you want to go fast and you want to find emails pretty quickly, once every minute. Let's say you have a full inbox, right? Well, maybe you go ahead and do that, but that's going to cost you 1,440 requests every single day, right? So that's a lot of requests, because that's how many minutes are in a day. The issue with that is that you might only have 2,500 workflow executions on your plan, which means that you're literally going to burn through this in a matter of a couple days. And so this is not an economic plan. Now, if we switch over to what it means to have like a webhook, or when we're waiting for like an instant trigger, what happens is that you only pay for this request to find data when it comes in. So inversely, you can think about like, with make.com is like, hey, now we have our Gmail account or whatever platform we're using only sending the requests over here when something actually arises. So hey, you get a notification and you have like a new email. Now at that point in time, because we received an email, it's going to send over. And so this is a totally different pricing model, but this is so much more economical because you only pay for what you use. You're not paying for just the option of seeing, hey, just the privilege pretty much of saying, hey, is there even something there? And so for that reason, I believe that n8n is definitely the loser in this category, and I would prefer make.com for these trigger types. Now, I want to point out here Google Sheets, specifically the watch for updates, and this is polling in n8n, and it's instant here. And the reason why is because honestly, like with most of these softwares, when you're kind of like storing data or building a database, the first place that you're probably thinking about doing that is Google Sheets, right? So you're going to go over to Google Sheets, you're going to create something, you can have data here, whatever you want, right? And so this is going to be the go-to option for you. Maybe you use Airtable and you pay 20 bucks a month, or maybe you just want to start small, don't spend any money, go with Google Sheets. And so if you're doing this and you want to wait for changes or whatever, this is just going to add up really quickly. And for that reason, I really like make.com. Now, just as like of a couple days ago, they did have an issue with their watch change functionality here. And so there is a workaround, and this is something I'll cover later. But essentially, yeah, there is a solution out here if you guys are wondering why this isn't working out of the box like it used to. And I'll cover that in a separate video. The next thing about triggers here is scheduling them. And so with n8n, they use something called cron expressions. And so that just makes it a bit more complicated. It's not the end of the world, but it does make it a bit more complicated. And so let's talk about cron expressions here. If I was to go into this trigger, okay, and I was to try and find like some custom variant that's not a minute, not every hour, not every day, week, or month, no problem, you can go into custom. But the thing is that they require something called a cron expression. And until I actually read this, I was like, what the F is that? Like, I've never heard about this in my entire life before. And I know software engineering, and I've just never heard of that. So anyways, what this is just a different way of expressing measurements of time. And so essentially, if you come into their docs here, they just have examples of like, hey, this is what a second is with a cron expression. And this is what a minute is, and an hour, and a day, and a week, and all that kind of stuff. And so this is just, I don't know, it's just one layer of confusion that's added onto this, which I don't think has to necessarily be there. And what I like about make.com is that they don't do it that way. They just have like, you know, every minute or every hour or whatever. So if I come in here and I add a module, and this is like Gmail or whatever, and I say I want to watch for emails coming in, I can just say like, okay, how many results do I want to get? And then also I can just choose like the schedule down here. And it's like, okay, how often is this firing? Once every 15 minutes, once every 1 minute, all that kind of stuff. You can choose and configure this however you want. And so for that reason, I really do like how simple make.com make.com has made it. Now, on to the next thing here. I want to talk about pinned data and mock data, and this is two game changers that n8n released, which honestly, I'm baffled that make.com doesn't have this. It just drives me up the wall. If you guys use make.com, I'm sure it drives you up the wall as well. So pinned data is going to be super useful throughout the entire flow here, not only in the trigger step, but in all the other steps after this. So let's give this a shot. Conventionally, if you wanted to run this workflow in something like make.com, right, you'd have to, first of all, start the trigger, right? So we can go ahead and test this step. And I'm just, walking through this to show you how long this could really take. I'd have to go into the form every single time, enter in my information, and then process that request, right? And submit it. If I wanted to go back and submit it again and again and again, I would keep having to go back and forth and back and forth. And obviously that's a massive pain in the butt and it's gonna take a lot of time. And so with the pin data, what we can do here is just hit this pin right here. And then all of a sudden we can use this test data over and over and over again. Once we push it live, you just unpin it or whatever and it works. But this is a great way to just speed up the process so you don't have to keep coming back to, for example, submitting forms every single time, because I don't think anyone likes doing that. And so that's just one example here. And so past that, you can pin other things. So like take, for example, this workflow here. We could pin, of course, the trigger here. We could pin OpenAI, we could pin many different parts of this. And so you can just speed up whatever part of the workflow it is that you're looking to speed up. And so you can do this in make.com as well. It's just a bit more challenging. So take this workflow, for example. I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing. So we're gonna unlink this first and we're gonna move this Google Drive folder up top here and we can run this once, okay? And it looks like nothing came through. So I'm actually gonna just choose where to start so I can load in by default a PDF document. And we're just loading in any test data here. It really doesn't matter what it is, but just for the purpose of this demo, we can load in mock or test data by essentially hitting the plus button here and then doing JSON and parse JSON. And so with this, now we can just get access to all of this kind of stuff by downloading the output bundle, copying everything, and then pasting that into this JSON trigger here, saving that, unlinking it, and then essentially running this workflow as the trigger here, right? And then if we had like a, for example, I don't know, a tools section, I'm just grabbing whatever here, just to kind of showcase what this looks like, then we can use this as the trigger moving forward, right? And this is probably the best way to do it, but this is also not ideal compared to n8n, which is just super easy outside the box. So we can run this, we can get the exact same data over here that we got in the Google Drive, and we can use this test data for every future operation, right? Such as this. And so we could just map it in here and then so on and so forth. But the problem is that once you map it in here, then you have to delete this and then attach it back. And that's obviously a pain in the butt. And so because of that, I think that with the pinned data feature, n8n definitely is going to be much better here. And the next thing that I want to talk about is mock data. And so if we circle back to this workflow here, we can see that we have this pinned data here, right? All of this is pinned and we can see that up here. But the cool thing is we don't just have to use this if we want to edit this. So take, for example, you have this switch statement and you're like, okay, I need to test one side of the switch and then afterwards I want to test the second side, but I need to make sure that the variable here that is causing this to switch, right? Whether like test, for example, equals 1 or whether test equals 2, it's going to determine which path this goes down, whether it's, whichever one it is. We can come in here and then automatically swap out like a variable here by hitting this pencil button here and then editing this. So we could change, for example, the message here. This is a test message. We could even add things at the bottom here. We could say test data and then just say whatever we want to, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Save it and then run with the updated mock data that we just created. And similarly, we can do this in this parse JSON module here. But again, it's just a bit more of a pain in the butt to do. I don't really like the interface here as much. And again, if we want to change it back to the original trigger, now we have to unlink it and then we have to re-integrate every single one of these future modules back into the original trigger, right? Because if we had every single one of these modules here every single one of these attached to the parse JSON test data, we'd have to unlink it, put it back to Google Drive, and then remap everything here, which is going to take a lot of time, right? Because we can see that if I load in a variable here, like this, for example, this is currently linked to the parse JSON, but we'd have to link it to the Google Drive. So obviously kind of annoying. And for that reason, I think that the mock data in n8n is super, super nice. And similarly with deactivating a module. So take a look at this. I think that n8n does a much better job. And so if, for example, I want to turn off a module, no problem. I can do that very easily using n8n. All we have to do is hit the 3 dots right here. If you guys can see that right up here. And we just deactivate the module, and then no longer is it going to run, right? And so obviously super nice. You can do this in make.com as well. And how you do something like this is take, for example, if I wanted to essentially remove this module here, I just have to unlink it. So I'd unlink it on one side, unlink it on the second side, and so on and so forth. You can see it's already becoming a pain, and then link it back in together. And so you can do it both ways. It's just one is easier and one is a bit more challenging. And so that is effectively deactivating a module, which is going to be much nicer in n8n. We can scroll down the page and we can look at some other things as well. And so when it comes to functions, okay, I do tend to think that make.com is going to be easier for beginners rather than, for example, functions in n8n. So let's explore this a bit deeper because I think this is pretty cool. So take, for example, we have a function in n8n, or sorry, make.com, and we just have something like a text function, which is length. And I put in the word test here. What length does is it just says, hey, how many words or how many characters, pardon me, are in here? And the answer should be 4. So if we run this, it will return 4. And this is just like a built-in function within make.com that we can use, which is really, really nice, right? And you can do the same thing in n8n, and let's give this a shot. I'm going to open up this function here, and I'm going to just create a test variable here and do the same thing. So if I wanted to do this, I would have to switch this over to an expression, click in double curly braces, and then I would essentially have to do like test.length here, and we can see the result is 4. And so this is more or less the exact same way of doing it, but this is now code, right? And you actually have to write this expression out. And if you want to do other more complicated functions, of course, it's just going to be more difficult. So unless you have the background, then it's not going to be easy. And first of all, you can do this, but you have to know that it actually exists in an n8n. You might not actually know it exists unless you have that coding background. But if you do have that coding background, then this is going to be a huge game changer because you can essentially do all types of different functions in here, and you're not just limited to what you can see in make.com's predefined functions library here. So that's really cool. So depending on where you're at, if you're a programmer, then n8n is probably going to be way better for you. If you're not a programmer, then the built-in functions in make.com are going to be super nice. Moving forward here, we have from AI functions. I just think this is so cool, and I wanted to highlight this in general because make.com doesn't even have this functionality. And so if we open up a new AI agent here, essentially what this AI agent is doing is it's creating, updating, deleting, getting, all that kind of stuff, Google Calendar events here. And so let's take a look at creating a calendar event here. We have this from AI function right here, right? And what this is doing effectively is it's doing all the heavy lifting for you. So instead of you actually having to write in here like, hey, like this is the start time or this is the end time, you're just gonna tell the AI, hey, can you please generate me the start time and the end time? And so practically speaking, how this works is like, you're gonna have a system message coming through, right? Take this workflow, for example, here. We have a message coming from Telegram, right? And so we're taking a message like that, and somewhere in that message, it's going to say, hey, the start time is like 5 p.m. or 4 p.m. or whatever. And it's going to automatically take that unstructured data that it's pulling in from Telegram. It's going to send that into this Google Calendar to create that event. And it's going to automatically know when the start time is right here, when the end time is right here, when the summary is, right? So long gone are the days where you even have to put this stuff in. The AI is just going to freaking do it for you. So that's really, really cool, right? Super super cool functionality. And so for that reason, that's another cool thing that n8n has to offer. Now moving forward, text aggregators. This is something that make.com does really well. And as of this recording, I don't even think that n8n has this functionality. Of course, there are workarounds to this, but out of the box, you can do this in make.com. So take a look at my text aggregating scenario in make.com here. Bottom line is what happens is we get data just like this client bundle here, right? And if I just download it, it's going to be easier to see. We have a array here of clients, which is a fancy way of saying a list. And we have multiple different clients. John, we have Sarah, we have Michael, we have Emily, we have David. Imagine these are leads coming in to your CRM every single day. And maybe you want to send yourself an email every single day of all the leads you got. And so what we'd want to do is convert this into like text with all of these different people in the same text file. So we don't want to send like 10 emails. We want to send one email with every single result. And so with make.com, this makes it really easy. I run the scenario. We go through every single one of these individual people, which the people stand for like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here. If I just open this up, the first one's John, for example. And so we go through them individually, one by one here, and then we aggregate them together. And as a message, we can see like, hey, here are the people, here's their name, and then here is their email, and it goes back and forth. And this is nice, right? If you want to bundle data together, especially text, it makes it super easy within make.com. But if you were to do the same thing in n8n, for example, with a workflow like this, it's going to be way more difficult. And so with something like this, you'd essentially have to do multiple steps, including adding in custom code. Now with this custom code, with stuff like this, you don't need to know how to code, you just need to know how to ask ChatGPT to do the coding for you. So as long as you say what you're looking for, you can build this out, but it's not as straightforward and there is a bit more complexity involved in it. And for that reason, I really do like this feature. This is something I actually use quite often as well. So this is really cool. And for that reason, make.com wins on that particular step. The next thing I want to talk about is wait steps here, and this is definitely a winner for n8n as opposed to make.com. So let's dive into what this actually means when I say that. So essentially with n8n, you have wait steps here, and these wait steps can be in terms of seconds, in terms of minutes, in terms of hours, in terms of days. You can literally have a scenario that lasts seconds or it could be days, right? And that's really cool. And you might think, well, obviously that's like, how else would it be? But that's not the case with make.com. And so with make.com, what happens is if we just add in like a wait step here, first of all, it's called sleep. And this sleep has a maximum of 300 seconds. So you can't have this wait for like days or even hours or even tons of minutes. It's 300 seconds, right? That's nothing, it's 5 minutes, and that's the maximum, right? So that's a huge drawback of the system. So because of that reason, I really, really like how n8n has structured their wait sequences here, because you can wait for days as opposed to just a maximum of 300 seconds. On to the next thing, we have routers. And this is something that I like that make.com did better instead of n8n. And so when we take a router, when we think about a router, this is what a router is. You go down one of multiple paths. And why I like this in make.com is because the thing is with a router, it goes down multiple paths, but it's not saying, hey, you only go down one path or the other path, because you can ultimately go down two paths, and it can just make your code a bit more module, like a bit more just easier to dissect and work with. And it's just nice. I like the fact that you can split it up. But with something like n8n, that's just not a possibility. So you have these switch statements, and it's like a switch is like a conditional if statement. So let's talk about this switch statement for a second here. So essentially what's going on is it's checking a particular condition. So if we go back to our example here, the condition that we're checking is the budget. So let's say we have a budget of like $1,000, okay? And that is like the input to the scenario. So we have this input coming in, that input is $1,000. And we have a lot of different instances. We want to route people down different paths. So path number 1 here is for people at like $0 to $100, and my face might be blocking that. And path number 2 here is like, hey, anyone from like $100 to $1,000. And then path number 3 here is like, okay, anyone from 1,000 plus. And then over here, it might be like anyone at like 5,000 plus, right? And essentially with a switch statement, only one of these can be true at the same time, but you can't have multiple paths that are true at the same time. And what a switch statement will do is it will find the first right path. So let's say we have another path down here, which is like literally, again, $1,000 exactly. Let's just say $1,000. What's gonna go on here is we're gonna get our particular input here, right? And we're checking, hey, which of these routes does this match? Does it match A, B, C, D, or E, right? And so it's gonna go down, it's gonna be like, okay, well, it's not 0 to 100. And let's just say that this is like in between. And like, let's say it's not this, but then we're like, okay, it's exactly 1,000 plus. Well, then it checks off this scenario here and we're good to go, right? And it's not even gonna look at this scenario or the last scenario because it's already found a condition and it's already been met, right? So it's gonna go down the first path where the condition is correct, right? And with this, you can also have like a fallback value at the end here where you say like, hey, if none of the conditions are met, then we're gonna go down a fallback value, right? And so more or less, that is exactly how switch statements work in n8n, but the only thing is that it can only go down one path at a time, which is this guy right here, as opposed to it going down potentially multiple paths using make.com. And so because of that, I do kind of like how it works in make.com. Maybe I'm just biased and like, you know, I'm just used to it. But what you can do is you can have multiple switch statements here, right? And so that is definitely an option as well, where you can, yeah, just keep having multiple switch statements going for as long as you want to get as many different options in here. And so for that reason, I do like make.com when it comes to when it comes to routers. But on the flip side, what n8n does really well that make.com doesn't is merges. And so with merges, essentially you can just merge everything back in. So say you have one path, you have two paths, or you have three paths, you can just merge it all back together. You can merge up to 9 or 10 different steps in a row here, right? So if you have really complicated workflows, you can merge them all back together. And this is just, to me, it's just such a nice piece of functionality. And you can do this in make.com through something called get and set variables here, right? And so let me walk through how this essentially works. I'm going to unlink this. I'm going to drag these over. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another module here. And this module is just going to be like a basic trigger. And this is located in the tool section here. And it should be, okay, let's just call this a set variable. And it doesn't really matter what we put here. All I need to do is move this trigger over here so that you guys can kind of see what this looks like. Okay, that's not working well. So we'll go ahead and do tools. We'll try this again. Here we go. We have a basic trigger. I'm going to move the trigger overwards, and we don't have to do anything fancy here. All I've done is move this trigger over. Now I'm going to delete this, and then I'm going to connect these back in together. Okay, and so we can effectively do a merge where we can merge data from here into here. And how this works is through a get and a set variable. So we have set variable right here, and then we have a get variable here. And so what's going on is we will effectively name this set variable, okay, and we'll give it a value. And this value can be hard-coded. It could also be like a custom variable. So we could put in like test here, for example, and this test we're getting from the trigger here. And then what happens is after this runs, we're gonna go down path B next, and then we can just find the variable test here, right? And so if we run this scenario now, and I'm just gonna unlink this as well, and we run it, now we should be able to get the response from here, right? And how we did this was through getting and setting. And so we're essentially in the getting variable, we're finding a variable in another path, which is up here, right? And we're finding that based on some variable name with test. And because this has a variable name of test up here, it's just getting the variable value. And so that's more or less the exact same as this merge here. it's just obviously not as convenient, not as nice, and it's obviously not as good. So for that reason, I do really like how n8n has done this, and this is like a no-brainer piece of functionality that I'm actually shocked that make.com does not have. And so the next thing that I want to talk about here is built-in code. And so if we look at make.com, they don't even have like a built-in code builder. Like if I go in here and I do like code or whatever, they just have nothing available. And so you have to use third-party applications like Zero Code Kit, which by the way costs a freaking ton of money to use. And so this is just something that's like a pain in the ass. And it's something that honestly should be native to these software, to these applications, both of them. And meanwhile, n8n has this code editor. And the crazy thing that I don't like about this is you'd think that like for people that are advanced, make.com would be like, hey, we're just going to give you the option. Most people won't use it, but at least we're not going to close doors. But they decided, hey, we're just going to close doors. We're not even going to give people the option to do this. And so that's kind of the frustrating thing if you're an advanced user. Whereas with n8n, they're like, hey, for advanced users, you know, we're going to give you the functionality you're looking for. If you want to code and do all that kind of stuff in here, you can write whatever it is that you want. And so for that reason, I do really like how n8n has built in custom code into their particular platform. The next thing here that I want to talk about is other AI tools. So this is kind of like on par with each other, but essentially with make.com, they just released this a couple days ago, but you have all these kind of AI tools. So you can categorize text, you can identify language, you can extract information from text using AI, you can summarize text, translate it, all that kind of stuff. And same kind of deal with n8n. You can also just go into their advanced AI section here, and you have access to all of these different features here. So a lot of these are the same, like for example, information extractor, and I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but sentiment analysis and text classifier. I'm just going to zoom in here so hopefully my face isn't blocking it. And so a lot of this stuff's very similar, and a couple of these things are different on both sides, but overall they both have the option to have some built-in AI plugins for you guys to leverage. And for that reason, I just kind of put them as neutral. But what I do like about n8n is they have other AI tools that make.com hasn't released yet. I'm sure they will get around to releasing it. And unfortunately, my face is blocking it. But at the bottom of this, there's something called other AI nodes. And if I click into that, then you have access to literally all of these other things. And this is essentially for RAG system, retrieval augmented generation. And so you can build out your own vector database here, right? And you have all the tools you need to do that. So document loaders, for example, is like handling PDF processing. You can turn that into text and load that into into your database. Your vector database, and you have memory to be able to recall things, and you can output things properly, or you have ways to split text properly so that you can actually enter in text properly into the vector database so that it's easier to retrieve high quality results. And you have vector stores, which is blocked in embeddings. And so everything that you need to deal with retrieval augmented generation and building out your own database, which I think is like literally the future of this kind of technology, is all here. You have it all here, and make.com does not have that. This kind of falls under the same umbrella as AI agents. And I'm sure that in the future, make.com is going to be rolling this out as well. But for now, for sure, n8n wins the cake on this one. The next thing is looping. And so what looping is essentially you take a scenario like this, right? And you just loop it over and over and over again, right? And this is nice in n8n, and it's kind of a pain in the butt when it comes to make.com. So with something like this, essentially, I'll just give you some preface here. We're doing a voice agent call. And the problem with something like this is that we call, but we don't know when the call is going to finish. It could be 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, right? And so with this, there's lots of different ways to do this, but I just found this is the easiest way. Is we loop over. We wait 5 seconds and we loop. We check, is the call done? No, we loop back again. We check if the call's done. No, we loop back again. We check if the call's done. And maybe on like the 10th or the 20th time, it's going to check the call's done and it's going to finish the workflow. And so this makes it super easy to just go in an infinite loop until this is done, and then you move on to the next step. But if you try and do this in make.com, you don't even really have that functionality. You just have a repeater here, and this does not get the job done effectively. And this is just, yeah, it's just not really that good at all. And for that reason, n8n n8n is definitely better when it comes to looping. So the next thing I want to talk about is extracting data, and n8n for sure wins on this metric as well. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. So let's say that you have a document like this, right? You have a PDF document and you want to turn this into text. And there's a lot of information on this document that we need to take out, right? And so with make.com, conventionally what you'd have to do is essentially you'd have to have that document stored somewhere, likely in Google Drive. So you'd have to figure out, okay, first of all, I need to store this document in Google Drive, and then I need to use an external plugin like pdf.co, and I need to convert that PDF into text. And this is something that you have to use multiple external plugins to do, which means that you have to pay for this, right? And this is basic functionality that probably should be in make.com. But flash forward to n8n and you can just do that automatically. And so something like this is just built in. So for example, we have Google Sheets here, or sorry, Google Drive. We're waiting for something to be created, and then we download it, and then we automatically extract data. And this is kind of what it looks like. We have our PDF coming in here, right? We're gonna take this, and then what we're gonna do is we're going to send it over to this. And here is where that text is, right? This is the whole contract. And it's the same kind of deal if we look at the other scenario here. Like if we were to look at this pdf.co document, we also have the text buried somewhere in the body here, and we can see it right here, right? So this is the whole document. It's just a different way of doing more or less the exact same thing. And for that reason, I really like how this is just built into n8n. Moving forward from here, oops, I just need to go back into presenter mode here. Moving forward, both make.com and n8n have sub-scenarios. And what a sub-scenario is that essentially one main scenario can call a secondary scenario. So if we look at this module here, we have an AI agent. And the problem with this is that, like, if you go into the tools section here, you click it, there's not a lot of options on the right-hand side. So it's very limited, but you can unlock all of the other modules. So take, for example, you click here, you can unlock all of these modules, and there's a ton more if you just create, and I'll just scroll for days to show you guys what that looks like. You can unlock all of them if you call a workflow tool. So you're calling a sub agent. And so this functionality is very easy. It's very, very easy in n8n. And it also is easy with make.com. They just rolled this out too. They have, you know, a scenario module where you can just choose another scenario like this. I can be like, hey, start this secondary scenario in make.com. But the only problem is that you're likely going to pass in parameters. And what I mean by that is, like, if we just go back to something like this, for example, let's say that this is the voice AI agent. So let's go back to this voice AI agent back here. We need to pass in, like, who are we calling? What's the name of the person? What is the purpose of the call? And there's so many things that you'd want to pass into this workflow. You just don't want to start something randomly without any additional context, right? You need to pass in certain information to get it to work properly. And so the problem with make.com is that in order to do that, you need to go into you need to go and create custom system variables. But this you need to upgrade to get. And so you have to be on a pretty high plan to be able to upgrade this. So unless you're already on a high plan, this is just costly. And it's like a simple feature that honestly is like pretty much required. It's necessary, but they're going to cost you money. Whereas with n8n, they're not going to charge you anything for that. And for that reason, I do like subflows in n8n better. The next thing that I want to talk about is mapping variables and also hidden values as well. And so if we just circle back here to kind of like n8n and make.com, what I do like about make.com is they do make it quite easy. So we have, like, I just loaded in sample data here, and we can kind of take a look and see this is kind of what mapping looks like. It's just really easy. And when I mean easy, I just mean like you don't have to look at it. It's not hard to read the data. And so for that reason, I kind of like it. And if you look at something like, for example, n8n, it might just be a bit more difficult to read this data, right? Tables, not so much, JSON a bit more, but you also have this. So I think it's like really neutral. But one thing that I do really like about n8n is that they don't hide data from you. So let me talk about hidden data, and this is a huge defect, I think, in make.com. So if I go into JSON here, and there's like deeply nested objects, this is what JSON looks like. It's a way of formatting data, and it's like the backbone of n8n and make.com. But essentially you have like arrays and objects, and I'm gonna make another video on this. But essentially, more or less, if you're more used to it, you have like, you know, just things inside. You can think about this as like a folder, and then within this folder you have another folder, and then you have another folder, and then you have the person's name, right? So you have essentially one folder within another folder within another folder. And you can have one folder down here within another folder, here within another folder, here within another folder here. And so it just goes on, right? And the cool thing with n8n is that you can just see all the data here. It's very, very simple to see. There's nothing that's hidden. But if you go over to make.com and you try and do the same thing, and I just like load in tons of data here, the problem becomes that like I might not see all of the data. I'm just seeing the first instance of the data, right? And so effectively, let me just kind of open this up and show you one more time, practically speaking, what that looks like. So for example, we can see skills here and then tools. And it just says this one here. And you can see it says one right there, right? Meaning that this is a list or an array, and there's multiple things in this, but it's only showing you the first result. You do not have the ability to see the second, third, fifth, or the 20th, or however many there are. You only get to see the first, that's it. You want to see more? Too bad, you can't see it. You have to load in a different way. And so that's kind of frustrating, whereas with n8n, if we circle back to this, you can just go into JSON and be like, okay, I'm just gonna scroll down and see all of the data, right? And so for that reason, I do really like how they've done the mapping here with 3 different versions, and they've also done the hidden values really well here because there's nothing that's hidden. You can see it in multiple different ways. You can see it in table data. You can see it in, and we can just open this back up again, but you can see it whether it's a schema, whether it's a table, whether it's JSON data, whatever the case is, you're able to see that. And so for that reason, really, really happy with how n8n did it here. So moving past this, what I want to talk about is debugging scenarios and the debugging interface for scenarios. And so with this, I think that the debugging scenario, n8n has won, whereas make.com has not. So let's circle back to explain what this looks like. So we have this debugging scenario in n8n, right? And the cool thing about this is that you can have one debugging scenario for every single workflow. You can have 100 workflows, they all call the same debugging scenario, which is just so nice, right? You don't have to set this up every single time for different workflows. And so how you do this is you just have one of these error triggers here, right? And you can just find this if you just like hit the plus button, and then you have like triggers down here, and then there's like an error trigger, right? And so you can add this in. And the thing is for other workflows, you just hit these 3 dots here, and you go into the settings and you just choose what the error workflow is. And then anytime there's an error, it's just gonna, you know, automatically fire off your error scenario, and then maybe it notifies you here. You want to get an email, Slack message, text message, WhatsApp message, no matter what it is, you can automatically send that off. Makes it super nice, super convenient. But with make.com, what happens is that they don't have like a default kind of fallback scenario where every single workflow can trigger the same thing. So you have to handle errors by a workflow by workflow basis, and not only workflow by workflow basis, but a module by module basis, which means that if this has an error, it's going to break the scenario and fail it. And it's not going to fire off anything to your debugging scenario because you don't have like an error handler here. So with every single module, you have to create a separate error handler, and that gets quite tedious and time consuming and repetitive, right? And it's just a lot of redundancy when it would be nice to just have one scenario that kind of handles everything, and you're like, I'm good with this scenario and I'm happy with it. And the other reason too is like with make.com, if it fires an error, it could break the scenario, it can turn it off. And then, you know, if you have mission critical automations, you might not have time for these things to go down. And so, and especially if it's your clients too, like if you have clients and you're doing this and they figure out that like it's broken before you do, it's not gonna be good. And so for that reason, getting notified immediately when something happens is critical. And it's really nice how n8n has set that up. And so that is kind of debugging, like a general catch-all debugging scenario in both platforms. The next thing I want to talk about is debugging interfaces here. So let me explain what I mean by this. And so in make.com, you can kind of have like a dashboard in your history here, and you get to see every single log or every single instance of something running, right? And so effectively, if something breaks down, you can more or less catch it. You can go in to the details here and you can just see what it looks like and then fix it, right? And this is kind of what it looks like. You debug it and then it will tell you an error. And this is nice, but it's a double-edged sword, because it's nice because they just make it super easy. They're like, hey, this is the error. But it doesn't give you a lot of information to work with. So if you're a non-coder, this is great because you don't have something scary that you have to look at and try and figure out, but it doesn't give you the whole picture of it. So you might be grappling with the fact that you just might not be able to understand the full picture of what is actually going on, what's breaking, and how to solve it. Now flash forward to something like n8n. This is what a error looks like. And so with these scenarios here, you can just go into, for example, the executions tab here and then see all the past runs of the scenario. You just check, you just hit the executions, and then every individual run, similar to make, is just located on this side here. And so that's nice. And if you encounter an error, it's going to tell you kind of what that error is, and then it's going to give you the full message. And this is good if you're a coder, because you can kind of go through this and be like, okay, this makes sense. And I can read through kind of like line by line what's going on and what's caused an error. But if you're unfamiliar with this can be kind of overwhelming and you might not know what to do. Now, as a pro tip, you can just add this into ChatGPT and it should solve it for you most of the time, but it's obviously a bit complicated. And so for that reason, I do tend to think that make.com is a bit better, especially if you are new to the platforms. So moving on here, I'm going to talk about JSON and creating JSON in make.com and n8n. And so effectively, the next thing is that if you're like creating JSON data in n8n, you're going to want to create like a field here, right? And this field, you can just think about it like hitting this plus button, going into data transformation, and this edit field button here. But if you're going to create JSON, you have to choose the mode here, and it's JSON. And then you have to actually type in JSON here. You can get ChatGPT to do all of this for you, but if you're new to it, this is a bit intimidating. Whereas with make.com, what you can do is you can have this create JSON module right here. And there's two options for creating this. You can either like come in here, and I'm just gonna switch this trigger over, and you add it. You can generate it just like what we saw with n8n. This is the exact same as essentially this. So you can paste in JSON, or if you're unfamiliar with it, you can add JSON here, and then you can effectively choose add item here, and then you can just have this builder that does it for you. This is kind of abstracting the problem where you don't have to look at pure JSON code, and you can just have like a drag and drop builder, which is nice, but I also find this somewhat confusing too. And so you have all the data types here, and you can just choose whatever it is that you want, and you can build these complicated flows. But this is not also that easy, I think, either. It's you know, if you don't know JSON, this honestly, you ChatGPT and just asking it what to do might be easier than this. But this is another way of doing it, and it's nice if you don't want to deal with the actual hardcore JSON data. And so the next thing that I want to talk about, and we're almost done here, is switching JSON to text and back and forth, right? And so this is one thing that make.com does really well. And so if you run this test scenario here, we can create JSON, right? And this is kind of what it looks like. It's just in text. And then we can effectively just turn that into actual JSON data to use. And so if we look at this, what's going on here is we started with a string, okay? This is JSON in a string. And then this is JSON that's actually JSON that we can actually use in a future module. And so you can transform very easily JSON between text and JSON data back and forth in make.com. And this can be quite useful. And I'm sure if you start using these platforms very, very frequently, you will encounter this. And this is nice. This is very nice to have. And so if we kind of look at, n8n, for example, we can do more or less the same thing. So we're going to go ahead and create JSON here. And then we can also transform that JSON into, for example, text. So if we open this up, we just have a test string here, and we more or less are just passing things. Yeah, so sorry, we can put in like a string of JSON here, and then we can turn this into text, or we can turn this into JSON, whatever works. So like take for example, we just choose an object here. We can turn text into an object here really, really easily, and back and forth, right? I could also choose string and then run this again, and then it's just turning it back into a string and so on and so forth. So in both instances, it is pretty easy to do this. And I just thought that would be worth pointing out, but more or less, yeah, you can do both pretty easily in both platforms. And lastly, I just want to talk about project folders here. These are the last three: saving scenarios on exit page and turning a scenario active. And so these are small things, but like in n8n, you on like the first tier, you only have 2 folders, right? You have a personal folder and then you have whatever other folder. And if you have like 100 different scenarios in here, this is kind of a pain in the butt to have to like organize everything into 2 separate folders. Whereas with make.com, you can have unlimited folders. So for example, you have access to all of these folders that you want to create here, and the world's your oyster, right? It's pretty comprehensive, and for that reason, I do like make.com for that reason. And the last thing that I want to talk about here is turning scenarios active. And I'm just going to cross this one off the list because I do not want to include this in here. So turning scenarios active, just a really small thing, but in make.com, it's kind of annoying that when you're working on a scenario, you actually have to remember to click the back button here and then back out onto the other page. And then you actually have to turn it on. And a lot of times, I have forgotten to just do that. And then I just have scenarios that should be active, but they're not, right? And I forget. And so that's problematic. Whereas with n8n, that is just automatically built onto the same page, and you know for sure, like you're not forgetting, right? Because if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And this isn't out of sight and it's not out of mind. So this is really nice because you're just not going to encounter that same problem. So in a nutshell, that is all of the differences, the biggest differences that I found between the 2 platforms, whether you're using n8n or make.com. Please tell me in the comments below if you guys thought that I missed anything. I thought it was pretty comprehensive, but I'm sure there's a lot of things in here that I could have added on top of that. But more or less, that's a detailed breakdown of what to use. I think that ultimately speaking, if you're not like super gung-ho about doing AI agents immediately, I would probably just recommend sticking with whatever you've invested a lot of time in. If you're an expert in make.com, then maybe it's just best to stick there. If you're an expert in n8n, then I'd just stick there because they are one-to-one substitutes more or less, and you can switch, but the time cost of switching back and forth is quite heavy for the return on investment, which might not actually be that much. But if I was starting out from the ground up, I think that personally, like if I was going a mile deep into this, I'd be choosing n8n likely, just because a lot of the pain points that make.com has, n8n solved. But if you're looking to get things up and off the ground pretty fast, you're not looking to do anything when it comes to like coding or development or anything like that, then make.com might be the best option for you. I think both tools are fantastic. I'm going to use both of them. And yeah, it's honestly, it's a really, really hard choice, but that's it. Let me know what you guys think, and I'd love to hear what you guys think is the best option. You can leave that in the comment section down below. If you guys like this video, make sure to subscribe if you're new to the channel. And last thing here that I just want to point out, I have released my school community. We have 153 members here. We released this about a week ago, and this is a place where you can learn tons of different stuff about AI agents, automation, and AI in general. There's over 100 different unreleased videos on this platform that you can't find on YouTube. We have weekly group calls, and there's tons, literally every single blueprint I have that's on here that will allow you to pretty much automate your entire business. It took me years and years and years, and it's tested on my own business. And yeah, so if that's something that interests you guys, definitely take a look at this. Just want to say a huge thank you for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Thanks, and bye-bye.